Welcome you here on behalf of the Hannah Arendt Center for Politics and Humanities at Bard College. This is the first of three talks that Professor Philippe Nonet will be giving this week. There's two evening talks that go together. Tonight, Monday night, is part one of a two-part lecture that is called The Destiny of Freedom, from Kant to Heidegger. Tonight, I think we'll focus mostly on Kant. Mostly. And on Wednesday, we will be making the way towards Heidegger. So I hope that you all are able to come back on Wednesday. In addition, tomorrow, Tuesday, from 12 till 2:15 or so, there will be a lunch discussion of the Requiem, the Fauré and Verdi Requiem. And that's, if you're interested in coming to that, please just contact me either after the lecture or via email. There's just one or two spaces left. It's sort of a smaller space, but we still could get you in if you're interested. This is a real honor for me to have Professor Nonet here. Professor Nonet has a doctorate in law from the University of Liège. He also has a PhD from the University of Berkeley in sociology, or
yes,
in sociology. For many years, he taught in the law school and in the PhD program in jurisprudence and social policy at UC Berkeley, where, among other things, he was my doctoral advisor. And so it is a distinct honor to welcome him here for me. He is the author of two very influential books in the world of interdisciplinary legal studies. One is called Administrative Justice, and the other is called Law and Society in Transition, that he co-authored with Philip Selznick, another name some of you may know. 2 years ago, he was here in this very room and gave a lecture on the unity of tragedy and comedy that as someone was just saying, as we walked in, as Thomas Marcher was just saying, really did generate a lot of conversation that lasted for months after his talk here on the Bard campus. It's available in audio tape on our Arendt Center website, and so I encourage you to go check that out if you're so inclined. But without further ado, it is a real honor to welcome Professor Philippe Nonet. Thank you very much.
In a certain sense, this lecture is a sketch of the history of freedom from Kant to Heidegger. But we are not concerned with history as such, that is, as the succession of events in the passing of time. We are only concerned with our past insofar as there opens out of it a destiny for modern man. Therefore, the title I chose, The Destiny of Freedom. Indeed, our past puts us before the necessity of a decision regarding the destiny of freedom, a necessity that we can evade, but only at the greatest danger. So far, freedom has been thought as an attribute of the will. Indeed, as the will's highest possibility. But freedom of the will attains its most extreme possibility in the rise of modern technique. Technique, in turn, threatens to extinguish the freedom of man. Freedom of the will thus turns into an illusion that conceals an extreme form of servility, such as mankind has never known before. But when this illusion and concealment become apparent to men, if they do, there opens the possibility of a new birth of freedom, now detached from the will and grounded in what Heidegger calls the truth of being, die Wahrheit des Seins. Truth here in the sense of Greek aletheia, namely of unconcealment. It, aletheia, is to free freedom from the will. Thus the division of the lecture in two parts. First, the first concerns free will as the metaphysical origin of technique. And that concerns the history of freedom from Kant to our own times now. The second lecture on Wednesday will concern technique and the opening of a more fundamental possibility of freedom, detached from the will. And there our main object will be Heidegger's thought. We begin, therefore, today with the history of the free will as the origin of technique. We first note, as an introduction to what follows, an astonishing ambiguity in Kant's ethic. On the one hand, it is an ethic of pure duty, free of all utilitarian considerations. It is said to rest on the ground of the will to will, which in turn, as the cornerstone of modern metaphysics, culminates in the sway of technique and in the reduction of all good to value. That is, in the pure opposite of pure duty. We shall approach Kant by reading just one sentence of his, perhaps the most difficult sentence in all of Kant, and in any rate, the least understood. Thus, the necessity of being careful in disentangling the problems in it. It says, this is the first sentence of the first chapter of the foundation of the metaphysic of Sitten, another untranslatable word, which means something like the customs and usages of the people. I read the sentence. I'll read it twice, and I'll reformulate in a summary. It's in a summary fashion. It says in translation, "It is impossible to think of anything in the world, or indeed outside of it, that could be held as good without limitation, other than a good will." What is a will? A will is a power to propose to oneself an aim and to move oneself to actualize it. That is, to bring it into actuality, to bring it into being, to cause it to be. A good will, second question, is a will that is fit to will, and is to be an aim of willing itself, since it is a good, and a good is something that is desirable, and therefore something that is worthy of being posed as an end for the will. The will is to be an end to itself. A good will without limitation, that is unconditioned, absolute, infinite. The absolute good is therefore one that is always to be willed, along with the willing of every other contingent good. That is, in every willing, harbors in itself an absolute will to will, by virtue of which the will itself actualizes itself. Just as, remember Descartes, every thought rests upon the fulfillment of the self as a being who thinks. In every thought, I think. And thus I cause myself to be actualized as a thinking being. Such a goodwill is, as on the face of it, as an absolute will, the causa prima, the first cause of all possible goods. As a causa prima, as a first cause of all possible goods, it must itself be the cause of itself. It is therefore also a causa sui. The causa sui is the ultimate cause of the actualization of all subordinate aims. Causa prima and causa sui, as is well known to people who have read any philosophy, are names of God. The God of metaphysics, of course, not the God of any actual church. Such a goodwill, according to Kant, is to be pure, that is, unaffected by causes alien to its own essence. That is, entirely determined by laws it gives itself in accordance with its own essence, that would make it free. Freedom is the power of a will to actualize itself in accordance with its own essence. Shall I repeat? Freedom is the power of the will to actualize itself in accordance with its own essence. As the summum bonum, the highest good, such a free will is the being that most is. That is the most actual. That is the summum ens, the highest being, namely, again, God, the God of metaphysics again. This summum ens fulfills itself in the essence of being. Being here in the sense of das Sein. In English, we cannot make, according to ordinary grammar, a distinction between das Sein and das Seiende, and therefore we throw ourselves constantly in immense confusion. In order to clarify our minds regarding these matters, we need to move into another language. One possible such language is the German of the 18th and 19th century. The summum ens fulfills in itself the essence of being, and accordingly, the essence of being, the essence of das Sein, is willing. We have here, in a nutshell, the fundamental principles of modern metaphysics since Kant. They remain unchanged all the way through our times, though we are no longer aware of that most of the time. This metaphysic shows the presence of God in man, in the form of an unconditional obligation or an unconditional commitment to will freely. How am I doing on time? Okay. We must, for want of time, pass over the thought of Hegel and Schelling, in which there occurs no substantial innovation with respect to philosophical language on this matter, that is, on the matter of the essence of being as will. Since we pass over Hegel and Schelling at some plus, we turn now briefly to the last of the great thinkers of the history of metaphysics, whose work precedes the extinction of metaphysical inquiry, which occurs in our times under the sway of technique. And we are speaking here, of course, of Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche's thought is at bottom an extreme form of Kantianism. It would take a lot more time to demonstrate this than I can afford in this hour. But I can give a few hints of the direction in which to see, to recognize the kinship between the two thinkers, a kinship that Nietzsche himself ignored. He rather thought of Kant's position as an antipode of his own. That means that he had not done his homework regarding Kant. That's all. He had a very short life as a thinker, remember. In Nietzsche, the will to will, the Kantian will to will, takes the form of the will to power. So the demonstration of the identity between Nietzsche and Kant here turns on showing that the will to will is nothing other than the will to power, and vice versa. Nietzsche conceives the will as a power to command itself. That is, to speak Kantianly, to give itself laws in accordance with its essence as a power of command. The will is a will to power. What is power here? Power is mastery of the conditions of the will's effectiveness in actualizing itself. The will to will commands itself to command the fulfillment of the values it posits for itself. Values with Nietzsche, and it already begins before him, but it's sort of finalized by him, is the modern way to think of the good. As we all know from our own speech, or at least from the speech of newspapers. Among the highest values that the will commands itself to effect is truth, between quotes. Truth as the knowledge of beings, namely das Seiende here, insofar as such knowledge secures the power that the will has attained. But the higher value still is the value of art, which stimulates the will to enhance itself and thus attain higher levels of life, higher levels of will to power. The will to power is thus ultimately a will to overpower itself. Man is to rise from just being man, the last man, to becoming overman, the one who has overpowered man and who keeps overpowering himself as part of its own essence. Now, this will to power deifies itself as the god of the highest life, namely Dionysus, which it itself, namely the will to power, elevates for itself as that which will guide its self-overpowering. Accordingly, the essence of life, which is another way in Nietzsche's parlance to say the essence of being, das Sein, is will to power. I take it that a short comparison between this list of theses regarding the will to power and the list of theses regarding the will to will in Kant will show that they are fundamentally the same. And we now turn to the age of technique. In the age of technique, which follows in its fulfillment the end of Nietzsche, Western mankind ceases to put itself metaphysical questions, with the consequence that the will to will rises to a position of unchallenged domination. No questions any longer arises about its essence, the possibility of its actuality, the kinds of aims that are suitable to it. There are, of course, exceptions to this metaphysical blindness. They are most notably a few descendants of Nietzsche himself, namely Rainer Maria Rilke and Ernst Jünger, whose work still remains to be noticed in the English-speaking world. The will to power, having become unchallenged in its domination, transforms itself in ways that remain largely unexamined. All matters concerning humanity are now referred to the so-called sciences of man, namely biology, history, psychology, sociology. Sciences which are constitutionally incapable of even posing any question regarding the essence of man. They are compelled by virtue of their own intellectual structure to take for granted what they take to be the essence of man. Now, in accordance with the teaching of Nietzsche, the concept of value comes to exclude all other possible forms of the good. This is shown in the fact that it is said that art is a value, an aesthetic value, that God is a value, maybe the highest value, but still a value, and so forth. This transformation of the good into value as an exclusive possible form of the good assures in principle that from now on the good will be regarded as radically calculable. That is, radically commensurable. And that is in turn radically interchangeable. all human ends are substitutable to one another. At the same time, and this is perhaps what is hardest to see, indeed so hard that even a profound thinker like Max Weber was unable to come to terms with it. The will, Max Weber was another descendant of Nietzsche, at least in his old days. The will loses all character of self-command and self-surpassment. Its freedom, now conceived as the power to dispose of all forces of nature, becomes a never-ending task at which man is destined to devote his labor. Thus, it may be said, the homo animal rational, which is the classical Latin definition of the humanity of man. Man is the animal endowed with reason, turns into the homo animal laborans, the homo whose essence is laboring humanity, not working, laboring. It is important here to maintain the distinction between work and labor. In the modern world, no one works, but everyone labors. And so the freedom of the will gives birth to universal servitude, an astonishing phenomenon long ago pointed out by Max Weber, who called it die herrenlose Sklaverei, slavery without master. What then is it to which this servility gives obedience? Weber never was able to conceive an answer to that. We shall first hear a possible answer to that question from Heidegger, and that will be our topic for next Wednesday coming. So I did it even faster than I thought I would. So will you take the questions?
Are there, and let me suggest that my experience with Professor Nonet suggests that there's no question too simple, and that I do hope you begin with whatever you're wondering about. So are there questions from the floor? Yeah.
Can you repeat your definition of the Kantian definition of will, please? I missed it.
Yeah. According to Kant, will is a power to represent aims to itself, or to propose aim to itself. The German word is Vorstellen. And to move itself to actualize the aim it has proposed to itself. Is that clear enough? One shouldn't take for granted that these definitions reach the heart of the matter. All kinds of things are latent in it that are problematic. For example, will conceived in a Kantian way is not desire. If you think of it in an Aristotelian way, then it is desire. it is orexis, noeticate to be sure, but orexis still. Nietzsche, this points again the kinship between Nietzsche and Kant also denies that the will is desired along the same lines, as a matter of fact, despite his attempts to invert Kant. There would be much more to be said there. The relation between the will and its power to effect its aim is always highly problematic. So nothing is said about that in the Kantian definition. It's just said that the will has the power to move itself, to actualize itself.
I'd like to understand better why Nietzsche is Kantian on the question of the will. And the first part of the question is if you could just say more about that. And second, more specifically, it seems that Nietzsche has in mind the possibility of a complete perversion or even a loss of the will in the sense of the last man. And so if Nietzsche is a Kantian on the question of the will, does that mean that there's a possibility that Kant in some sense can be thought to contemplate the last man? I don't know how I would even think about that.
Well, that depends upon a careful reading of the end of the first chapter of the Untitled, where it becomes apparent that Kant asserts on the one hand that the possibility of free will or of obedience to duty is open to every man. What has to be seen, and it's somewhat hidden in the text, I don't have it before me so that I cannot point it out to you, is that this is a possibility from which every man can run away. The running away from the possibility of obedience to true duty is the same as the diminishing of the will to power in the last man. In the last man, the thought of self-surpassment, of an overpowering of oneself by one's own will, is simply so utterly terrifying that one runs away from it. Yeah. Now, I don't know that this answers the first part of your question, which was, in what way is the will to power the same as the will to will? Is that it? I thought I had said.
You did say it, I just didn't fully grasp it. So if you could even maybe just say the same thing again.
Or say it in different ways. Many of these things can be said in multiple ways. This is contingent upon seeing the similarity between the Nietzschean concept of the will, on the one hand, as a power of command, and indeed of self-command, of command to oneself, and the Kantian concept of the will as a power to give itself its own laws, right? Command and law here are closely akin. Though, of course, in the concept of a law, there lies the concept of universality, the universality of the scope of the law, which is not quite readily apparent in the concept of command. it does become apparent only after one has closely studied the doctrine of the eternal recurrence of the same. The doctrine of the eternal recurrence of the same in Nietzsche is exactly identical with the concept of the categorical imperative in Kant. According to Kant, one is to govern oneself in accordance with maxims that can also be made universal laws. Yeah. I simplified the sentence a little bit, forgive me. Therefore, in Nietzsche, the concept of acting in such a way that what the principle of one's action can be wished to be eternal, that is to extend to the whole of being considered under the aspect of time rather than under the aspect of extension. Well, once you have seen that, you have seen that Nietzsche is a Kantian.
That's if you assume that you've just said that universality in Kant is the same as eternal in Nietzsche.
Yes.
But eternal return, in my mind, is a thought experiment where you measure the value of your own life by whether you could live it over again and again. That says nothing about the universality of that, of me wishing it for anyone else.
In wishing yourself to return precisely in the form in which you have occurred now, you wish the whole world to return, because your own being is intricately involved in all its aspects with the being of the rest of the world. Does that answer you?
It answers it.
Well, I don't. In the end, this does nothing to remove the extraordinary mystery and obscurity of the concept of eternal recurrence. But here we had to go to that in order to see that the emphasis of command as against law did not drive Nietzsche away from the concept of universality, though he might very well himself deny that it does. From the fact that Nietzsche taught the doctrine of eternal recurrence of the same, it doesn't follow that he himself grasped the full implications of it, right?
Philippe, maybe it would be helpful just to follow up on these couple of questions.
Yes.
To give us a sense of the difference between Nietzsche and Kant as well. You've presented the provocative claim of Nietzsche as Kant an extremist, but there's also differences between the goodwill and the will to power, or are there? Or do you want? I mean, how would you express the differences?
The most manifest apparent difference, I think, is the difference between the concept of the good in Kant and the concept of value in Nietzsche, right? Now, once one has seen this, one has seen the direction in which to think further. The concept of value secures the calculability of the good. Yes? All right. Well, is Kantian thinking free from calculation?
So according to what? So why do you think that Nietzsche's notion of value gives us a way to calculate the good? How do you get the good into?
It is the way. It is the principle of the radical commensurability of all forms of the good. Their reducibility to a scale of value. That is their comparability and the calculability of the judgment that one goes this way rather than that. So value this concept of value is not peculiar to me or Nietzsche and so forth. If you want to see a first precise explanation of it, look at Hegel's Grundlinien der Philosophie des Reichs, outlines of the philosophy of right. I think it is paragraph 63. It is in the transition from property to contract. So the concept of value, in the end, is the concept of the foundation of any kind of pricing. Now, this brings out another connection. Kant denies that there is any pricing in the judgment of the goodness of an action. I return to my question, is Kant free from calculation? There is, by the way, something that is never to be forgotten, that Kant is, after all, the thinker who thought through the foundation of modern science, in the sense of modern mathematical physics. Now, modern mathematical physics is entirely focused on the calculability of movements of mass and energy and whatnot. Kant is among those who made possible the application of mathematics to physics, right? And therefore to the calculability of being. So there lies in Kant already clearly at least the seeds of an irresolvable conflict between science and technique on the other hand, because physics is nothing other than technique, and the concept of duty. Kant made numerous efforts to overcome this this inevitable conflict. All of his attempts to do so involved him in intricate difficulties, in inextricable ones. I can't demonstrate that in all this respect, but Kant maintains, at least at the formally conceptual level, the necessity that there be an identity between the thinking that governs the essence of nature and the thinking that governs the essence of man. One is by analogy to the other and vice versa. So there.
Okay, yeah. That's the first and second critique, right? And then the third might actually be a moment where he tries to reconcile the two with the communicability of, it's the third part of the third critique.
Beautiful?
Yeah.
Well, but the third critique can only be understood from its second part, which is the teleology of nature. That determines everything that precedes it, and it brings into the thinking regarding nature something of the thinking regarding the goodness of human actions and so forth. But it's very troublesome.
Other student questions?
I saw a hand in the back.
In the back, yes.
You characterize labor as inherently different from work. And so what
Inherently different from?
From work. So
Oh, labor. I thought I heard Weber.
So how is labor different from work, and why do people labor today rather than work?
And are you offering an Arendtian distinction?
I can only give a hint here. An artist a genuine artist. I don't mean what passes for an artist nowadays. I mean a great artist, such as Rilke or Bach or whatever, works. He brings into being a work that stands on its own and in its glory. And indeed, in this work, there becomes visible what the essence of the totality of being is. That is what constitutes a work of art in any art whatsoever, be it music, painting, it doesn't matter. All art is the production of works in which the totality of being is made visible. That is work. There is no art in the modern world. If you wish to be convinced of that, just take a walk in any city built in the United States or in Europe after the destruction of the aristocracies of Europe. Art vanished in architecture with the destruction of aristocracies. It is never to be revived as long as a democracy remains the rule by which we govern ourselves. It is condemned in advance to be inadmissible. But labor, I made the mistakes against which I was warning you. Labor is the way of being of modern men. And you have lived in a college now for a number of years. What is it that it does? It prepares you to labor. That is to become servants of the sphere of technique, functionaries of the technical order. That's what you are destined now to become, like it or not. You will face the truth regarding yourself the day you face the truth of the way in which you are condemned to labor. To labor is to be the servant of an impossible task, a task that is never ended. The task here is the task of reaching mastery over the earth. It is a fantastic illusion of modern man to which we shall return, that he may, with his labor, someday conquer nature in such a way that he will be the Lord of the earth. That is sheer fantasy. But it is, in part, the ground of the servility into which people are kept. The servility here consists in having to serve ends that are, to speak in a Kantian way, contrary to one's own essence. In servitude, one loses one's freedom, in the sense of the freedom of the will, as well as freedom in the sense of the openness to truth. More on that when we turn to Heidegger on Wednesday.
Franz?
Yeah, I have two questions. Number one, since you make this distinction between labor and work,
yeah.
Do you see yourself, do you see yourself as a worker or as a laborer? And my second question has to do with Ernst Jünger, but maybe you want to answer the first question first.
I am a modern man. And a large part of my existence is therefore determined by labor. Yeah? So, and indeed, a large part of my existence was to come and see the truth of that, and with the hope that you see the truth of it from weakness and freedom. So, am I laboring now? I sort of doubt it. I have retired. So I come to this free from the service, not free from service, free from servility, I think. It's not for me to be the judge of that. I'm sure that I still harbor a great deal of blindness towards myself. So that was your first question. The second one was-
I was a bit puzzled by your connection, the connection that you make to Ernst Jünger.
And Ernst Jünger,
Yeah,
yeah.
because of, I'm somewhat puzzled because of Jünger's sort of fascist
Jünger,
leanings,
fascist?
totalitarian leanings. And,
Nah, none at all.
that's probably the reason why he hasn't gained a lot of currency in this country.
No, it's because people don't read German. Sure, Jünger wrote a major piece, which is the, what is it called? The totale Mobilisierung, or something.
Die große Mobilmachung.
Huh?
Die große Mobilmachung?
The totale.
Mobilization.
Totale Mobilmachung, yeah, something like that. Anyhow, this refers to totalitarianism. What is totalitarian? It is the sway of technique. The sway of technique is the origin of totalitarianism. It has nothing to do with fascism or with communism or the things of that sort. The totalitarianism is visible in the most manifest way in our whole world in this country, where everything is mobilized. What does that mean? Everything becomes capable of being used. Capable of being used. Why? Because it has value. And this claim to the reduction of value, of goods to value, extends to all beings. That's the sense of the total mobilization in Jünger's work. Yeah.
Yeah, so I looked over your definition. I thought it through. And I
It's
found...
not mine, by the way. I was quoting your Kant.
Sorry, yeah. The modern conception of the will. And I found what was bothering me in this whole narrative and all these different developments that kind of come out of this conception of the will.
Yes.
For example, and that it's the will ultimately defeating itself. By trying to overcome itself, it transcends its limits, but eventually destroys itself. I mean, that's how I see it. But here's what I found, is that this power to represent aims to itself is kind of, it's a very open term. It's a loophole. A loophole, which permits desire to subsume morality.
No, not in Kant at any rate.
I mean,
nor in Nietzsche.
I mean, why are you saying that?
Because I'm repeating to you what they say.
Okay, and so what happens with morality? Because it's completely absent from all of this.
What happens to morality? Morality is, to be summed up, the law of the absolute necessity of duty.
I mean, that's kind of looking at it from the outside. If you look at it on the inside, it's good and evil. If you look on the outside at people carrying out their lives according to morality, of course it's the absolute necessity of duty. But you can't deny that from a individual perspective, it's following. It's trying to follow good over evil.
Well, I don't know where you see that, but therefore I don't see the relevancy of that remark to what preceded. So I'm getting confused.
Oh, I'm sorry about that.
I was going to say, following this, that the concept of morality is the concept of the absolute necessity of duty.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah? Then we must find a duty that has absolute necessity. The only possible duty that has absolute necessity is the duty to be free. That's Kant.
Yeah, but it's kind of...
So
It's
morality, therefore, ends up being grounded in the absolute goodness of the goodwill, which is the free will.
I mean, it's kind of taking out good from the goodwill. It's creating a new form of good, rather than thinking a kind of.
Kant did not invent the claim that morality is the absolute necessity of duty. That has a very long history before him. He just clarified the foundation of that concept and found it first of all thinkers in the absolute goodness of freedom.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thomas, did you have a question?
It was a similar question Franz has already answered. I was also wondering, I mean, he asked about yourself, but
So do you think closer to you because my hearing is not good.
I said I think you answered my question almost by answering to Franz's question, because my question was also whether you conceive of the modern philosopher as a laborer, and what make you. So you're saying
modern philosopher, if there is such a thing, I wouldn't be inclined to deny it. What passes for philosophy in the modern world is the radical service of science. The radical service of science is nothing other than the radical service of technique. It is pure labor.
And what about political crimes? Are they the outcome of technique as well, without action involved?
Well, I would have first to be enlightened by you on your concept of political crime. I myself don't know what that is.
Well, there's a history of genocides, for example, in the 20th century that I was given as an example for my understanding of political crime.
Genocide has a history going back to the history of the early Hebrew people. So it's as ancient as the being of man, even in such a great people as the ancient Hebrews.
Yeah, Anastasia.
Well, I really liked your comment on art. My mom's always trying to drive me to museums, and it's kind of painful. I was wondering if you could just go a little bit more into the argument about why democracy is the end of art, because I really would like to use that.
Against your mother?
Against anyone that's not in a museum.
I don't know that I would be able to say very much on that question in the context of what I have said so far. But it seems to me that you might be able to see a close connection between the idea of democracy, yes, that is, as in a sense, the universal self-determination of people, and technique as universal servitude. Yeah. So democracy and technique are the same. The next thing to show would be that under the sway of technique, as under the sway of democracy, they are the same in that respect. Art is not possible. One first step in showing this would be to show that in the modern age, under the sway of technique and of democracy, it has become impossible for mankind to ask itself essential questions. Yeah? That is, under the sway of technique, all questions regarding humanity, God, freedom, God knows what, are referred to sciences, namely to techniques. Sciences and technique are constitutionally unable to even pose such questions. Yes? Now, you cannot produce a work of art if you have not thought extraordinarily profoundly about precisely such questions. That doesn't happen in our age. It's very sad. It's very hard to accept that this is true. And yet, or recognizing that this is true is the only possibility we have of recovering some freedom, of recovering some possibility of art.
So, I mean, in terms of what's produced, is it then we're just creating more technology as opposed to works? Or what is the fruit of the labor of a so-called artist?
Well, we shall have more to say about that, but the thought metaphysically, technique is in the service of acquiring mastery of the disposition of forces of nature. Yeah? Now, this aim of a mastery over the disposition of forces of nature is a fantasy. Service in that of that aim, in that in the mastery of disposition of the forces of nature is essentially an illusion, a fantasy, something that is unattainable, and therefore you have, in espousing that, condemned yourself to eternal servitude.
Yes. Go ahead.
Speaking to the concept of art and also the statement that you have doubts about the existence of modern philosophers, you mentioned Bach, who arguably might be the most masterful of any form of music that was written up until that point. And so he becomes a master of technique, of presenting concepts that he works on through an established medium of thought. But then you have a more modern example in the concept of the composer Charles Ives, who presents an experience of humanity as is modernized by the existence of technology and technique. For example, he speaks to the concept of the electric hum that exists in our modern world, where if we were all to be silent, we would hear the buzzing of the world around us because of the technologies and techniques that we've crafted. And so, does it negate the work of an artist to be creating a perception or trying to make an understanding of a perception of our existence or the circumstances of our existence and how we come to express a concept of essential self in a world that has changed since composers or thinkers like Bach or Kant? Is it an
And
innovation to
in
create
passing, I
technique?
must say that it is a foregone failure of thinking regarding art if one thinks of it as expression of anything. So
You
that,
yourself said about art as being an expression of the essential self.
it doesn't matter.
Why not?
Kick away the word expression.
Manifestation? Is that better?
Well,
The
I don't know.
actualization of self through art music, perhaps?
No, none of that. None of that.
And what was Bach doing?
Well, I wanted to comment on something you said about Bach. It is true that Bach is the main thinker who made possible a mathematization of music. Yes? Some people preceded him, and indeed a French theoretician of music who was a student of Descartes and had learned from Descartes about this indispensability of mathematics for thinking, laid the foundation for what Kant only fulfilled in the vol temporary of this clavier. So with Bach and with Baroque art in general, art begins to succumb to technique. Yes? That is not completely fulfilled until modern times, we can't enter into all the details of that. So there is, as you say, in Bach a questionable element, a questionable prefiguration of the technical intelligibility of music itself.
We have time for just a few more questions. Yes.
I was wondering if you could elaborate on your definition of technique and possibly suggest some sort of alternative or some other thing to see.
Let's do that Wednesday.
Huh?
Let's do that Wednesday.
That's the point of the Wednesday lecture.
Okay. I guess I'm not really understanding what you mean by technique. It seems kind of...
Well, it's not a question of what I mean. Kant is the first to say, Descartes is the first to say that science, particularly physics, but also medical science, he hopes, promises to man that he will become maître et possesseur de la nature, master and possessor of nature. Yes. In Descartes' conception of science, there lies already latent everything about modern technique. Yeah? So that the modern conception of technique as the will to master the forces of nature so as to make them disposable by man has its foundation already laid out in Descartes. Descartes is one of the turning points in the emergence of modernity and technology. So does that help at all?
Yeah, I guess I'm still confused on how that relates to art as like domineering over nature.
How that relates to art?
Yeah.
Well, the only thing I've said about that so far is that it destroys the possibility of art. That is a relation to art. Yes. We live in an age where the only way in which thinking is recognized as thinking is when it is technical. when it is scientific. Nothing else has any intellectual validity. But the judgments of people about art, that's individual.